If I was in a time machine and I came here from 1980 to 2025 and saw people complaining about housing, I'd just be like, you guys are idiots. Look at the houses. Look how rich you are. Of course, look, you're basically unfathomably wealthy.
Yes.
And why are you still complaining?
G'day, humans. Welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. It is the dangerous question that is most likely to be on the tip of the tongue of a certain cohort of middle-class, middle-aged people at barbecues or bars. And that is, why are houses so bloody expensive? What has happened in the past half-century in rich Western countries to put houses into the millions of dollars, far out of the reach of the average working man? Last month, I got on this show Peter Tulip, one of Australia's leading economists, to give us the answer, the conventional economic answer for this. And it was absolutely fascinating. You should go back and listen to that episode if you're interested in this. Basically saying, look, there's more demand than there is supply. We are NIMBYs. Our councils love heritage protections. We don't want big skyscrapers right next to us. We don't want lots of townhouses crammed together. We like our streets the way that we are, and therefore we prevent people from building. And logically, if you have more demand than you have supply, prices will go up. After that episode dropped, we got pushback from a small cohort of economists who said, actually, that can't really explain what is going on. And if you really think about it carefully and you do your economics right, you may be led to a very, very uncomfortable conclusion indeed. The conclusion that house prices are not too high and the housing crisis is not, in fact, a crisis. Cameron Murray, today's guest, has a PhD in economics from the University of Sydney, and importantly, he then worked as a real estate developer in the property industry, so he knows what he's talking about. He is a friend and colleague of Peter Tulip's. The two of them disagree completely about the causes of the housing crisis, and so I wanted to get Cameron on to provide this counter-argument, really, to say, well, let's think carefully about what would constitute a housing crisis, where we are, what impact demographics and population and immigration and tax policy might have on housing in order to understand what is fixable and what ain't. Cameron writes the Fresh Economic Thinking blog on Substack. You should check it out, and I hope you enjoy as much as I did the one, the only, Cameron Murray.
The question is there something wrong with housing? We have this strange situation. A lot of people think that the price is wrong and there's the wrong number. And so I'd say, well, what's the right price? What's the right number? How do we know this? And I don't think we've interrogated that enough. And a lot of our reactions are more of a gut feel or an emotional response to what is.
Well, can I give you a couple of metrics that we might use?
Okay, let's do that.
If something that's essential for people to have in order to live not be a hobo, has been essentially doubling in value every 10 years for the past half century.
Okay.
That would be one metric. Another metric would be, is it possible for people who don't have wealthy parents who got into this particular industry early on when it was affordable to plausibly, on an average income, acquire this essential asset? Okay,
so the first one was kind of like a price to income type situation.
Or maybe just asset bubble question. Okay. Or,
So let me give you some other metrics. If we look at the Survey of Income and Housing, which is like the largest survey run by the ABS, I think there's about 18,000 people in it now. It runs every second year since the late 80s. If you look at the rent-to-income ratio for renter households, it's a flat line, 20%. Since the late 80s till the 2021 census, if we look at the census.
This is rents.
Yeah. So the renting.
So we're talking about two things, sort of, aren't we? We're talking about the affordability of renting and then buying.
Yeah. So let's get to that. If rents are flat, how can prices diverge from rents so much, right? How do they just do that? Well, they just do that because the relationship between rents and prices is called the yield or the capitalization rate, right? And so prices can rise, but the affordability of owning can stay fixed if the interest rate falls. because that's what ties those two things together. And since the 80s, so we had high interest rates in the 80s, then we had a 90s recession. And since that, we sort of had this price adjustment to these new low interest rates, which let prices rise while rents were flat. And that happened
because
globally.
Interest rates were so low.
Correct.
That
so
people who, at least if they were on a variable rate, not like in the States.
Well, you can always refinance to a lower rate in the US, right? So you can ratchet down when it's beneficial, and then when interest rates rise, just keep it and wait.
That's insane, isn't it?
It's pretty cool.
I want to talk about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Well, it's good for the buyer. It may not be good for the economy overall if it contributed to the crash in 2007, 2008.
Yeah, I think it's not clear at all.
Okay.
So we should get into that. So what you find, if the interest rate, think about during COVID, right? You could borrow $1 million at 2%. So a better way to think of that is...
I did, by the way.
Yeah,
I bought my first home in 2021 and I locked it in for 3 years through sheer dumb luck, and I was paying 2.05% in 2024 when everyone else was paying 8 or 9%.
Yeah, I got on too.
So stupid.
So I'm going to come back to that after this. Remind me about this 2021 period.
Yep.
So you could rent $1 million for $20,000 a year, or you could rent the house for $30,000. So it became cheaper to rent the money and become your own landlord and buy a house. Than
if
rent
you
the
could
money.
get a deposit, yeah.
Well, you'd be surprised that pre-financial crisis, you basically could get zero deposit mortgages, and you could still even get 5% deposit mortgages until the 2017 sort of Royal Commission. So
you could get zero down mortgages in the 2000s.
I got one.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, you could even borrow the stamp duty in some places. So they'll go, we'll give you 104.5% or 105%.
What was the bank's hedge?
A mortgage is more of a bet on your future income capacity than the house itself, right? So the house is collateral in case things go bad, but it's really a bet on your income earning capacity. So if you're young and your income's growing, they're pretty confident, right, that you're not suddenly not going to be able to.
Why aren't they anymore? Because of the law?
I'm not 100% sure. You can still get high loan-to-value ratio mortgages, but I don't think you get no deposit mortgages anymore.
No, 20% would be normal. Wouldn't it, today?
It's very conservative, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the average loan-to-value ratio these days across the whole mortgage book is only around 40 or 50%. So half of people have paid off half their mortgage. The Reserve Bank had some research out the other day. But the point, back to your metric thing, is, the price of the asset of housing must rise in a low interest rate environment. There is no economic environment where you can have a 10% yield on a house and 2% yield on cash, because people will just take the cash and get the 10%. So it kind of has to happen. They're tied together, which is why during COVID, for example, everyone thought the market's going to crash, right? Early 2020, we thought this is the end of the world, and interest rates started coming down. Lots of stimulus was in the works. And I did a podcast then, and people said, we should get out. Prices are going to crash, right? And I'm like, yeah, but your mortgage interest rates dropped from what then was around 4% to 2%. It's halved. How can the price fall when you're now paying half the interest? I said, it's more likely that prices are going to rise 20% than fall 20%. This is May 2020, during the panic.
You were wrong, because they rose more than 20%.
They rose heaps. And I remember people would write on the internet, where did this guy get his economics degree? The back of a cornflakes packet? And hey, I was very conservative, right? In Brisbane, I think it went up 45% in the next 2 years. So you've got to understand that the asset price of housing is tied to the macroeconomic factors.
Right. And the other thing that I would just mention there is a huge amount of money was being pumped into the economy and subsidies and direct cash payments to people and to businesses, right? Which they had nothing to do with, because we couldn't travel and we couldn't buy anything and supply chains were fucked up. So if you did have extra money, you could put it, there was one obvious thing to do with it, which would be to
move to the Gold Coast.
buy an apartment on the Gold Coast.
Yeah. That's right. And so actually that's another sort of factor that's happened. I think we confuse that when it comes to the rental market, is that a lot of the rental growth we've seen is just the inflation of all consumer prices in the economy because of the COVID era stimulus. And that's happened globally as well, right?
But just to clarify, sorry to finish that thought.
Rents in Sydney in real terms, compared to the price of other goods and services, are lower today than they were in 2015.
Right. They have not inflated as much as a
as overall
basket
inflation.
as the CPI.
It's actually fell for quite a few years.
There is an interesting thing that I've heard you talk about on this, which is that we often think that what rents are is what rents are being advertised on rental properties that are on the market. But actually there's a difference between what the rents being advertised are and what the rents that people are actually paying are. And journalists and academics sometimes make the mistake of just looking at all the rental ads and saying, look how high rents are. Well, that may just be that more expensive places are on the market at the moment. There may be
That's right.
other
There's a
reasons for that.
new luxury project in this suburb, which is half of the rental properties being advertised. Yeah. So you think about that like the ABS uses the analogy of the bathtub, right? The rental ads is the temperature of the water coming into the bath, and what you're paying is the temperature of the water in the bath. So yes, if you're adding more hot water, eventually your bath gets warmer. So you're adding higher new rents. Eventually people's rents go up. But a lot of people who haven't moved recently, they're not always getting their rents increased to match whatever the asking price is elsewhere, the asking rent.
So I don't want you to be misunderstood here. Are you suggesting, I mean, the straw man of your position would be, it really doesn't matter how expensive property is as long as interest rates are low enough that your repayments are affordable because people can still continue paying for it. But obviously that's not a long-term sustainable solution because interest rates won't remain low forever. Shocks will happen to the global economic system. There'll be reasons to raise interest rates. And then the property that was 400,000, well, they won't fall back enough.
Why not?
Because they never do. They never have. I mean, where can you point? Can you point me to a...
They have in Spain, in the US, in 1850s recessions and stuff. Like, they do sometimes.
But hang on, if there's if the property that my parents bought 40 years ago was 180 grand and now it's 4 million.
Yeah.
There's how high do interest rates have to go to get a $4 million property back to 180 grand or whatever that is in today's dollars?
So there's a few factors going on there. So you've got to, when you make a long-term comparison, you also have to say, so this house 40 years ago might have been, in the worst suburb, the furthest you could commute. That exact same house is not the same relative position or rank in the market as it was. It might be now a very desirable, gentrified suburb. So not only has...
But it's not. And also, I made that up just in case people think my parents have a $4 million house. Unfortunately, they sold that house in the 1990s. So that house would be worth $4 million.
Yeah.
But you can basically throw a dart at a dartboard, can't you, in terms of Sydney and Melbourne and markets like that. And yeah, you'll be able to give me a particular area in southwest Melbourne that hasn't performed as well as others. But anywhere where human beings want to live, where people want, coming back to the metric of,
that's another point.
Being able to live a life.
People want to live anywhere at the right price. And we have this strange, I think, how do I put it? This idea that we don't want to do everything. We just want well-located, cheap, high-quality housing. That's all we want. I'm like, well, but to have that in a market means that relative to that well-located, high-quality housing, the poorly located housing must be absolutely dirt cheap. So what you're just really saying is all prices should fall because the one I want is too expensive. And that's fine if you don't own a house.
Why can't you say all prices should fall because all of them are too expensive?
You can, if that's what you want. What you find, though, is the day after you buy a house at the barbecue, rather than being the one complaining, you're the one going, don't you think my suburb's, the next one to boom?
Yeah.
So you have this political economy issue. So I want to get into that, but before you mentioned something about you got your low interest rate in 2020.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
And I think you also mentioned something about, what people can't afford to buy houses these days. It's not widely known, but if you look at the 2021 census, you'll find that the home ownership rate increased between 2016 and 2021. So in August 2016, there was a census we all completed, and in August 2021. And it was something like 66.0% in 2016, 66.7%, right? So it's a slight increase. The big downward trend happened between 2011 and 2016 in terms of home ownership. So we had this big boom. But that 2021 census also misses you, if you bought your house after August as a homeowner. And what you find is that home ownership basically, new first home buying doubled in 2021 when we brought those low interest rates in during COVID. So we were tracking at something a little less than 90,000 per year first home buyers for the 5 years prior to that. And then we got something like 183,000 first home buyers in 2021. So we literally brought forward an extra year's worth of first home buying into that year. So in terms of the whole story of people can't afford houses these days, we've got to understand that, yes, we brought first home buyers from 2023 and 2024. We brought them forward into 2021 and 2022. So, of course, it's harder for those who are left in 2023 and 24. Those remaining potential first home, of course, it's harder for them because if it was easy, they would have bought earlier when the interest rates were low.
Right. I mean,
right?
Yeah, but I'm not that interested in what happened in a 5-year time frame. We're talking about a problem that is plaguing many countries, many hundreds of millions of people across a time frame basically since the end of the Second World War.
Okay. Well, let's go back. Let me give you a quote from a famous visitor to Sydney, right? This is what the first thing they noticed. They wrote it in their diary on the first day in Sydney. They said, I'm quoting, "The number of homes recently finished and others building is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house." Okay, who was that?
Probably like Queen Elizabeth II in 1925 or something.
You're right onto it. This was Charles Darwin when he visited Sydney on the HMS Beagle in 1836.
Right.
Population of New South Wales, 19,000. What were people in Sydney doing? Complaining about the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house, right?
Yeah, but you can be wrong. You can be wrong a lot and then right at some point.
What do you mean?
Well, you can be complaining. People can be whingers who complain about things a lot, but at some point they can be right. At some point,
I'm not saying they were wrong then. Yeah, I'm not saying they were wrong then, but we need to have the context of what we should expect from the market for housing, because I think that sort of helps us understand what we should or could do and what the consequences will be. Because if we don't understand what we get from the market, we could have the sort of, just let the market rip, it'll solve everything. Okay, well, pretty sure in 1836 we let the market rip. In the 1850s, if you search the archives in Queensland when we were auctioning off state land, privatising the land, the biggest gripe was all these wealthy British were coming over to buy the land and no one can afford to buy land in southeast Queensland. You can sort of fast forward to the end of the 19th century, 1872, the housing question was Friedrich Engels in Germany complaining about the housing situation in the industrial cities of Europe, right? The biggest issue of the time was the expensive housing in the growing cities. Go to 1879, we've got Henry George complaining of the same thing, the enigma of progress and poverty. And when we have all this growth and innovation, we end up with all these people left behind in the cities and this poverty. Then we can go to the 1910 New South Wales first rents inquiry into the problem of rising rents in Sydney, right? Then we've got the 1919 Piddington inquiry into the problem of rising rents. Then we have the 1937 slum abolition inquiry in Victoria, right? Of the problem of slum housing in the cities. And it just goes on and on and on, right? So
Cameron, has anyone ever accused you of being a nerd? Because that was impressive. That was like nerd level knowledge. But is your point that there's nothing aberrant about the situation at the moment?
Yeah. My point is the market is doing what we should expect the market to do. That's what I think. We've got this, and I think sometimes we have this emotional reaction like, the market's doing something wrong. It must be those nasty planners, or it must be this, or the politician I don't like. Yet if we zoom out and we look abroad and we look historically, housing's doing what housing always does. It goes in cycles. It leaves people behind during booms and busts. It squeezes people out. It's, a good.
But hang on, is that true for the past half century in Australia?
So now you're getting to the sort of anomalous part of the housing history.
Yeah, it's
right?
a pretty fucking long anomaly. If it's almost everyone who's alive has never experienced anything else.
Not really. So let's go to this before the Second World War. Okay. We've got, the slum abolition inquiries. We've got all these high rents in the city. We've got these classic Victorian cases about what a fair wage is so that a worker can afford a house in Melbourne. Now, you're testing my memory here, but I'll remember his name later.
You'll lose your nerd cred, Cameron.
Oh, no. Sorry, guys. Home ownership in Australian cities then was around 40%, touch over 40%. prior to the Second World War. It's nearly 70% today, right? So we're doing better than we were for 150 years before the Second World War in terms of home ownership.
Well, there were 13 people living in Australia before the Second World War. Everyone has arrived since the Second World War.
Oh, there's a few million still, yeah. You're testing my nerd knowledge, but I think it was nearly
But you know what I mean.
4.5 million or something, right?
Yeah. It was a completely different country before. There was no immigration. I mean, it was the massive waves of
Well, that's interesting,
migration.
Right? So if there was no immigration, so we sort of had closed borders during the Depression and a bit in the 1920s. Housing was still a problem, right? So we can talk about that again as well. So the abnormal part of housing is really the 2 decades after the Second World War. Not just in Australia, but globally. It's abnormal in a lot of big parts of the economy. It's abnormal in healthcare, right? This is when we had national insurance for healthcare. It's when we came up with national pensions. We started the Commonwealth State Housing Agreements and soldier settlements and basically giving people stuff, right? Because we don't want returned soldiers marching in the street getting upset we've left them behind. So this was sort of a revolutionary time for the nerds in public policy land. And what happened in not just Australia, but many countries, we transformed housing from this thing that, poor people crammed together with extended families in slums in the city to actually we built new suburbs, subsidized people into home ownership and got, 30%, a third of all households out of renting and into home ownership to get it up to 70% by 1970.
And if people in America think about the rise of suburbia and the GI Bill and
I think that was the Freddie Mae, Fannie Mac. Or did I get them backwards?
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Yeah.
That was the period of subsidizing cheap mortgages as well, right? Which is essentially
the 1950s, Pleasantville.
Yeah. But that was the social policy of the time, and that's what transformed things. And housing's slow moving. So those people who owned homes raised families and had kids for the next 20 years, right? So I think what we do, and at the end of that sort of period, and in the 80s when we're sort of unwinding the government involvement in a lot of these areas, we had this period of high interest rates preventing a lot of speculation in all asset markets, right? So I think that's sort of the story you tell. So from today, I feel like there's a bit of a rose-tinted glasses view of, but back then everyone could afford this. Well, we could do that today. We could offer subsidized housing. Lots of countries do. But we have this strange debate where we think, no, the market will solve it. But if we look at the rollicking free markets of the 1800s, the biggest problem at the time was expensive housing and the boom and bust property cycle. And yet here we are sort of saying, no, that's going to solve our problem now.
I mean, I'm not sure. You're talking specifically to your economist colleagues who think that if we just build more, then the price will go down. But I don't think the layperson thinks that the market... I mean, I think the layperson thinks that the market is broken and we need to spend a lot more money.
Okay, well,
on public housing, and
I trust the people.
And I think everyone knows that negative gearing is a problem in Australia. I think everybody I don't say that they're necessarily right because I don't know enough economics to understand it. But I think that people are aware that there are policy levers that are not being deployed that could be deployed to get.
Look, I don't think negative gearing is a big issue in property markets. No one's making people pay a price that results in a negative cash flow, right? But they do that because they're expecting growth. And there are periods of time during a slump where you can't, except for fancy suburbs of Sydney, houses are positively geared because people think it's risky, so the price is lower. In the early 2000s in sort of suburban Queensland, before that boom, you could positively gear houses because people thought, I'm not going to buy it unless I get a positive return because I don't think there's a future growth potential here.
Yeah.
So negative gearing...
No, I think negative gearing has become a proxy word in Australia for what I think is a bigger philosophical concern that people have, which is about a financialization of real estate, so that instead of it being... I think if you polled, and you may have done this, so tell me if I'm wrong, if you polled 1,000 Australians about why are house prices so high, and you probably wouldn't even need to ask them, they would probably just say they are. I think their explanations would coalesce around something along the lines of it has become a way for people who have assets to be able to invest and get big returns, and people own 10 properties and rent them out, and all of the incentives are towards the top end of town to allow wealthy Chinese buyers to swoop in and treat them like a financialized instrument instead of prioritizing the core principle that it's a it's an accommodation for a human being, and that should be that there's a sense that there's a cart before the horse thing. And what you pointed to earlier about the political problem of this is really keen, because the media only wants to talk about how sad it is that property prices are really high, but everyone who then gets into the property market, of course, doesn't want to lose their shirt. Yeah. I don't want the fortune that I paid for my tiny inner west terrace to be frittered away and for me to still owe it to the bank. So of course I want to get capital growth, but it sounds nasty to say that. On the other hand, I think it is nasty for people who, through no doing of their own, just happen to buy an $80,000 home in Balmain in 1978 to resent any policy that would bring it down from being 4.2 million to 3.8 million.
So in my book, The Great Housing Hijack, I call this the symmetry of property markets. People who own property, their income is the rent and the rising capital value, the rising value of the house. Their incentive is to keep prices up and keep rents up. And then there's the people who pay rent and haven't bought yet. And dollar for dollar, any benefit to those who own home is a loss for those renters or those future buyers. And that is the sort of behind all of housing is this tension that I think we try and avoid. We try and say, no, there's a housing crisis when it's just an investment return boom, right? For 70% of the population.
For the people who have already bought in.
Yeah. And so what you'll hear is like a politician at breakfast will go to a property council thing and we're going to support you guys and housing's going to be a great investment in this country. What does that mean? That means rents and prices are going to rise. If it's it's not a great investment if they're going to fall.
Yeah.
Right. So at breakfast they say that, and then at dinner they go to the social housing group and go, "No, we're going to help the poor and we're going to bring down prices and rents," because we're just avoiding this sort of distributional issue at the heart of housing. Right. That every policy change that creates a winner, the new home buyer or the renter, creates a loser in terms of the landlord. And this is why I think for 200 years we've had this conversation, and only very brief political moments was there the opportunity to do something pretty substantial.
But I think the concern, Cameron, is that the two sides of that equation used to be the same cohort of people at different stages in their life. I think people have a sense that, of course there's a house prices go up. Well, if you've bought, then that's great. And if you haven't bought, that's not great. But you will buy and then it'll be great. That was the logic up until maybe as recently as 6 or 7 years ago. Certainly up until like 15 years ago, when median prices in big cities were still under $1 million, it was conceivable that there was a way for average people to save up 10 or 20% and get into the market.
Yeah.
The sense that people have now, I think why they're angry, is that those two sides of the equation are becoming, the fear is, different populations, and we're becoming a bifurcated society where there are the people who had the resources to get in when they did, and now if you're starting from scratch, the prices are just too high in comparison to both historically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get the fear, and I think that's true in certain wealthy
If it's been growing
pockets.
3 or 4 times higher than inflation for a half century or whatever it is.
It hasn't. Yeah, I think we get confused with nominal numbers, right?
I got a graph. That's Australian house prices with
What do we got?
2010.
Let's hit the graph.
This is
I get my nerd on here.
Yeah, where's my glasses gone? I'm going blind.
Is it nominal prices?
It doesn't say, unfortunately. It just says, it says real.
Oh, okay.
Real residential property prices for Australia.
Yeah.
This is from the Bank for International Settlements, right?
Oh, yeah. Be careful with their data.
Really?
Yeah, because they're trying to create consistent data from different methods in different countries.
Okay, well, we can quibble over the data if you want.
It's probably roughly right. Yeah.
But so 2010 is set as the baseline. I don't know why they've done that.
That's right. Set any baseline.
Yeah. So 2022, 12 years later, is 140 to 145.
45.
So it's up 45%.
Correct.
This is Australia-wide, right? So it's going to be much worse if you're in Sydney or Melbourne. And 2000 is...
No, Melbourne prices haven't moved much in the last 7 or 8 years. They're historically cheap relative to Sydney. In fact, Brisbane's historically expensive relative to Sydney.
Yeah. That's because everyone in Sydney bought a place in Brisbane.
Yeah, I'm actually looking at the real estate windows here and thinking, geez, that's not too bad, actually. Would you believe?
And so from 2000, what's that? 2000 is about 55% of the value. So it doubled between 2000 and 2010.
Yeah, correct.
And then another almost 50% in the next 10 years. And you can, it's like...
So a few things there.
And that's real. That's after adjusting for inflation.
Yeah, but not adjusting for income. So real incomes for households have increased as well, right? So that we're paying more in rents than we do in terms of sort of consumer prices. And secondly, you should expect prices to double if you halve the interest rate. So if you're paying 8% in 2000, you're paying 4% today, you must double the price relative to the rent.
It tripled, but... Yeah.
That's okay.
That's okay.
It might come down. It goes up and down here. Look at this, If you go
just for people who can't see the graph, which is everyone, when he says it goes up and down, he means it goes up, 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 and then there's a tiny little dip, and then it keeps going up, 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 and then there's a tiny little dip.
I'll give you an example. I sold a house in 2009 in Ipswich,
it's the suburbs of Brisbane,
suburbs,
basically.
Outskirts of Brisbane, basically. I don't know what the equivalent here is.
Probably Gosford, maybe.
I don't know. And of $200 and something thousand in 2009, the person who bought it from me sold it for the exact same price in 2019.
Yeah,
nominally.
That is, but so your point. You did that person just happened to get the one spot. Honestly, you're about the 8th economist who's given me that exact example of someone buying in southeast Queensland at that exact time because it's the one cherry that they can pick out of the basket of rotting cherries.
My point is, right, the housing asset market has to match over the long term the returns of all other assets, right? So if we have 10 years of negative cash flow because we're negative gearing plus flat nominal returns, which are essentially declining real returns. So 10 years, you're looking at 30% real decline. It's a huge loss. So to just catch up to the overall asset market means we have to do quite. But
are you saying it was right? So yes. This comes back to my description of the way I think most people would articulate the problem, which is that it's being conceived of as an asset and treated as an asset, and the market is the sort of primary consideration rather than governments deploying policies that
that's
treat it
always
as a
been
place
the
for
case.
people to live
you can't sort of detach it unless you stop people trading. So I'll give you an example of how do you...
No, you don't have to stop people. I mean, there are jurisdictions that make it harder or easier, right? Limiting the number of properties that you can own to individual human beings. Each individual human being can...
So for example, in Singapore, right?
Taxation.
Your first home has no stamp duty. Your second home has 30%. If you're a foreign buyer, you've got to pay 60% to the government if you want to buy property, right? So they're just basically saying, sorry, you only get one, or you pay us. And that's fine. That's a redistributive policy to intervene in potential trades in the market. We could do that if you want. That's what they do. But I think it's important to remember that housing has always been an asset, right? Property is the first asset that exists, that lords would secure their wealth with property.
It's called real.
Yeah, it's real.
Estate.
It's the real estate. It's the main game in town, right? So if you don't want it to be like that, somehow you have to create a way to access housing.
That's sort of I think you're aligning something there, Cameron, because it hasn't been an act. Yes, it's real estate, and lords sat on their land, and empires conquered land, and land is the kind of ultimate asset in the sense that it is finite, it is real.
Yeah.
It was not the case that there was an expectation that people would be flipping houses, selling them, getting tax breaks on them, doing them. It was not a wheelie-dealy business.
Yeah.
It was the most concrete and sort of profound asset that one could own. And most people couldn't own it because we were in feudal societies or the church owned everything or whatever. And it's only quite recently, right, in the post-war era, that this dream of home ownership has come about, where it's every little guy can own his little quarter-acre block. And the sense is that the 1950s dream of every little guy owning a quarter-acre block has given way to a kind of 1980s to 2000s reality of, yes, hyper low interest rates. A lot of people blame Alan Greenspan for having caused the financial crisis in the States. Some stripper in Florida owns 7 homes because she thinks she can get away with it. It's always going to go up. And there's this kind of wheelie-dealy sort of Reaganite attitude towards property that replaced the sort of gravitas that you're claiming real estate has. I think that's how people would. What's wrong with that diagnosis?
What's wrong with that? Well, I would cast them back into the 1880s Victorian land boom and read a book called The Land Boomers, which essentially describes what you said.
But who had the ability to do that? We're talking about probably 5% of the population who were able to.
Well, 40% owned land, in that sort of period. So you got the top third of people essentially were wheeling and dealing on land, subdividing estates, building mansions. There's a lot of legacy buildings in Melbourne from that period of flipping houses.
You're talking about here?
Yeah, in Victoria, in Melbourne in the 1880s. And so there's a book called The Land Boomers, which basically documents that period and the low interest rates and the speculation and the fever and the newspapers, like wall-to-wall coverage of what everyone's properties are doing. And I'm sitting, so this whole idea that, property used to be this, boring thing. And no, this is...
Again, I guess I was thinking of places where human beings actually live. Like in the UK in the 1850s, what proportion of the population owned land?
Oh, I have no idea, but I'm sure there were speculative fevers. The biggest economic issue of that.
Gentry.
Yeah, that's right. And now that's 2/3 of us, which is why we love talking about real estate. I mean, our newspapers are literally real estate advertising businesses with gossip columns attached, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I remember, before I became a parent and before I owned property, I remember vowing to myself in my 20s, do not become the kind of middle-aged, middle-class asshole who's always talking about nothing apart from real estate and schools and what fucking schools your stupid kids are going to go to. No one gives a shit about your stupid kid's school. No one gives a shit about your renovation or your mortgage repayments. And now every party I'm at or every Barbie, I'm like, guys, what have we become? Look at us.
This is, for the international listeners probably don't realize, the Aussies are not like the Paul Hogan, Crocodile Dundee, where we gossip about housing, schools, and we're kind of dibber-dobbers as well. Like, we're not the wild man.
We've sold the world on this image of us all being Steve Irwin, but actually we're cosmopolitan pussies who walk around with our almond lattes and Chardonnay.
So I think we're getting sort of back to that point of, what do we want from housing? Like, because 2/3 of people don't mind the speculation, the trading. They're in the game. They're happy with prices rising. They get very unhappy if prices fall. And in fact, that pattern there of those long-term real house prices pretty much exists in most countries as well.
Yeah.
And you could mount an argument that this is our macroeconomic regime now, that when we have a recession or a decline in growth or a decline in asset prices, we reduce interest rates to encourage higher asset prices through housing and in general. And so if that's your sort of macroeconomic setting, then you must have this situation of this ratcheting falling interest rate and then ratcheting up prices.
Is that a wrong setting?
That's a good question. I think the consequences, the stability has been good. Australia hasn't had a deep, prolonged recession since the 90s. So it has been reasonabry stable.
Well, we've had good economic stewardship, and we've got a lot of a lot of natural resources, and
we have.
Because the only reason I'm quibbling is because America also had really low interest rates, and they did have recessions. So you can't thank the interest rates, the low interest rates, for not having.
Well, and it's true now in Canada and New Zealand, right? That their house prices are falling, they're having a recession, and they're dropping interest rates because they're like, oh, house prices are falling. We actually don't like this. I forgot.
Yeah,
let's get them up again. Let's bail everyone out.
I think you're talking the difficulty in having these conversations in public and the media is that you're always pissing off one side of the equation or the other, right? The people who have a vested interest in their property growing in price versus the people who aren't in the market and don't want and want housing to be affordable. But we're looking at a sort of quite a small snapshot. This is part of the problem. It reminds me a bit of the problem of politics, of democratic politics in general, which is politicians have to win you over for what they're going to do next month or next year, but we have problems that require decade or century-long solutions, right? And similarly, this whole conversation about what a property price is going to do tomorrow and are they going down, are they up or down from the past month is what obsesses us. But I think many people, if they were given the opportunity to step back and go, all right, at a macro time level, is the change that has happened since the 1980s or 90s in the ability of average people who can't inherit property to acquire property, a good or a bad thing. I think a lot of people who are sitting on the $2.5 million property that they bought for $100,000 30 years ago would say, I'd rather it just be 1.5. I'd rather it had never gotten to 2. Because I have nothing to do with that money anyway. I don't want to go and move to Estonia and cash out the money. I just want to be able to live in the city where my family and my friends live in, and this is all academic anyway. It's just on paper, so I would rather it never had happened.
Well, yeah, okay. Good question. Let's try and break it apart a little there. So are you saying there's a concern about not the price of living in a house, which is the rent, but the price of being a homeowner?
Correct.
And it's not the cost per year of repaying the mortgage, it's at, for some reason, the sticker price? Or do you think the cost per... So if this interest rate's lower and your mortgage repayment's the same, is that okay?
I think it's both. I think the number one hurdle is the sticker price, is the deposit, because it's hard to get into. And it strikes me that every economic lever that you might be able to use to ameliorate that is only going to push prices up more. Like governments sometimes jump in and say, well, we'll cover the deposit, the Australian government currently is. Let's just park that question for a second, because I might be wrong about that. But then I do think that that it's just not good enough when you're entering into a 25 or 30 year agreement with a bank to say, but right now those repayments are fine, because nobody knows what interest rates are going to be in 15
They don't.
years.
So we have a buffer requirement on the interest rate, on the mortgage repayment assessment, right?
Yeah, in the sense they won't lend you.
Right? But typically what happens though is you get a mortgage and your income rises over time. And you pay off your mortgage. So even at a high loan to value ratio, if your income can service a bit of a buffer on that mortgage, it's not that risky. So that's okay. So I think it's
not the risk; it's the expense. You were asking me. Are we talking about home ownership or rental? I said home ownership. Then you said, are you objecting to the sticker price or the ongoing repayments? I'm saying it's partly the sticker price, and it's partly the fact that the ongoing repayments are variable over the course of the rest of your life.
But so are the rents that you're going to pay if you don't buy, right? So what you're doing is you're buying that risk of the repayment flows to avoid the risk of the rental flows. There's no alternative of just living in thin air. You gotta do one of them, right? And people will switch when they think that that's better long term than this. If they want, they might have other investment strategies. And so to just skip back to that idea that no one can afford houses these days, first home buying in the last 8 years has been much, much higher than the prior 8 years. So the 2010s was the real lull in first home buying in Australia.
And why was that? Was that the fallout from the financial crisis? Was that...
Yeah, a little bit. I think people were still shocked. So what you actually find is when prices are rising, first home buyers jump in more because they don't want to miss out. Right? And when prices are falling...
That's why we bought in 2021. It was like, we're just never going to be able to afford to get into this market.
That's right. And when prices are falling, first home buyers are like, well, why am I rushing in? Because prices are falling.
Yeah.
Right? So there's this weird thing of, if prices come down, people will be able to afford, but they won't want to afford it because they're like, why would I jump in now and have something that's worth less when I can just rent for another year and this thing's going to be $50,000 cheaper next year? So this sort of, it's really hard to create those win-win situations of make it cheap to buy without discouraging people from wanting to buy.
Right.
So I think the overall story nationwide is not that people can't afford housing. I'm going to make a prediction that when we do the census in August next year, 2026, we'll find that the home ownership rate is higher than it was in 2021, which is higher than it was in 2016. For a few reasons. One is that 2021 boom I talked about. That's not all in the previous census. Another one is in Victoria, land taxes were increased on investor property owners. And what happens in that situation is investors say, well, I thought I was getting this return on the asset. Now I've got this extra tax liability. I want to sell that and buy something else. And when landlords sell, the net effect must be that first home buyers buy. Right? Because they either sell to another landlord, in which case there's no net change, or they sell to a first home buyer. So what you see in Victoria is actually a decline in the stock of rental housing. And people go, this is terrible. See how that tax has reduced supply of rental housing. I'm like, hang on a minute. The number of homes is still growing. it's the stock of rental housing has shrunk. So somebody must be living there and owning it instead of renting it now. So that's an increase in home ownership. So if you combine that happening in Victoria, the sort of end of 2021 and 2022 elevated first home buying, plus this year you're going to see a little bit of a sort of bubble with the 5% deposit scheme, I reckon, we'll probably be over 67% home ownership again in August next year. So this idea that no one can buy houses, we're only sort of 3% off the peak in the early 1970s. If you go to New Zealand, they're about 10% off the peak. So they went from about 75 to 65% from the 80s to about now in terms of home ownership. So Australia's doing better than a lot of places.
Do we know or care whether or not those people come from families that didn't already own property?
No, we don't know much. We don't know much about the banker mum and dad or any of those.
The banker
things.
Mum and dad is an Australian saying about how your mum and dad have to like lend you hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the deposit to buy your first home.
That's a bit of a problem because the banker mum and dad was around in the 2000s boom as well. So I've benefited from the banker mum and dad. I know a lot of people who did.
I did. There's no way I could have gotten in.
So it's not like this is a new thing. But I think, again, it's this rose-tinted glasses of the past where we had sort of state and federal programs to do the role of banker mum and dad that actually boosted home ownership quite a lot.
Just before we leave interest rates, and I do because I know not everyone wants to talk about interest rates for an hour and a half, are you saying that so one of your arguments seems to be it doesn't really matter what the ostensible number
price.
on
correct.
the house is.
Right.
What matters is whether or not the average person can afford the repayments and
or
how
the
they
rent,
get, whether they can get, or the rent, and whether they can. We're just talking about buying now at the moment, though. We can get to rent. Once interest rates are very low, if interest rates are very low at some point, and prices keep going up, then does that mean that your argument no longer holds and now we've got a problem because interest rates can't go any lower? Like the increase in the price of the asset is outstripping the capacity of the government to lower interest rates indefinitely.
Surprised. You can still get 2% mortgages in some countries. In Japan, you can get a 1.3% mortgage.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying right now. I'm just saying as a hypothetical. Like, think about when during COVID, for example. Once the government has run out of ammo and interest rates are basically zero functionally, or in some European countries they were negative. Then an increase in property prices would be a problem by your theory because there's nothing else. Yeah,
but
there's no other way to soak up.
They won't keep going up then, right? Because they don't just go up for no reason. The people who pay that money are not idiots, right? They're like, well, I've got $2 million. Should I buy a house in Sydney at a 2% yield that won't go up in value? Or should I just buy an index fund that gives me 7 or 8% for no
But why
reason?
would it not go up in value?
Well, interest rates are zero. For the point you said, if everyone believed that was going to be the case, then everyone would internalize that expectation and not pay for it.
There's a world in which people don't believe that, but you believe it.
Oh, okay.
Right. So people, I mean, I don't think that.
You're just describing what economists would call irrational bubble, right? Like when we run out of people who believe something that doesn't come true, then the price.
No, there might be other reasons why prices go up. I mean, suppose we had high immigration. Suppose we were importing 500,000 people in a year, and suppose we had no new construction or not enough new construction, and interest rates were zero, then prices could still go up.
No,
and you wouldn't be able to say it doesn't matter because
they don't just go up. So this is a funny thing. People just go, there's more people and less houses, therefore price goes up. No. More people won't just buy an asset that's not going to make money compared to other things, right?
What if they need a place to live?
They can rent it. They can consolidate their housing. 4 people instead of 3 can live in the same place, right? There's 11 million houses. If we had one more person to every 10th house, that's 1 million extra people we squeeze in. You won't even notice, right? And that happens.
No, it depends who it is.
No, it happens. Like
if
during
it's an old
COVID,
Filipino
right?
gentleman who just comes into my house.
So during COVID, we actually spread out and filled up all those empty houses. And we kicked out people from share houses. We had home offices. We filled them up. We can reverse that, right? Because we have the fewest people per dwelling at any point in history right now. And I think people forget that when we talk about the quantity of homes. They're like, there's not enough housing. Mate, houses are bigger, better. There's fewer people in them than ever. Home ownership's near record highs. Like if I was in a time machine and I came here from 1980 to 2025 and saw people complaining about housing, I'd just be like, you guys are idiots. Look at the houses. Look how rich you are. Of course, look, you're basically unfathomably wealthy.
Yes.
And why are you still complaining? And
Yeah.
I could do that at any point in history. So we forget that. So I want to pick up that migration thing. People think, oh yeah, but if you add the quantity of people. Well, if I add the quantity of people, do BHP shares go up? No, only if it's a good investment. And that's true of housing, right? The housing market's very flexible. We've got 11 million houses. People squeeze in. They wait.
Not everybody needs to own shares.
Not everyone needs to own houses.
No, but everybody needs to participate in that market.
Yeah.
People don't need to participate in the share market at all, but everybody needs to participate in the property market, whether or not
so you
they're
can rent a room, share rooms, live with your parents. We do all this sort of stuff. You can do the opposite. Depends on your wealth. Like there's a lot of what economists would say margins for adjustment there. So yeah, the whole idea of there's a bit of a weird story that immigration's boosting house prices, and I think that the result, the economics is a lot more subtle. Right, because we had an immigration boom from sort of 2006-07 to the mid-2010s. Prices didn't really go too crazy for a little while. Then they did in the early 2010s, especially in Sydney. Then we had a construction boom. What you find is the second half of the 2010s, rents and prices were pretty much falling all over the country. So the headlines in Sydney then were things like double whammy for investors, rents and prices falling. Right? Of course, the headlines are still about property. Doesn't matter. This is the thing about property headlines, right?
Either way.
If it's booming, you go and find the suburb with the highest growth. That's your headline. If it's crashing, go and find the suburb with the highest. It's just like you're not going to have any.
And it's a calamity. It's a calamity either way. It's like if the prices go up by a lot, then it's unaffordable for the Aussie battler. If they go down by a lot, then it's like these people have lost their shirts.
Yeah, and so the media reporting of housing is so at the extremes and all these niche little things. It's very hard to get a good read. So the immigration point is that we adjust to this, and I like this analogy because immigration is just saying the quantity of people in houses is wrong, and that mismatch will do something, right? When we had like floods in Lismore, right, or in Brisbane, what happened to the housing market? We had then a mismatch. We had fewer houses, more people. It's essentially the same imbalances.
The houses were ruined by a flood, by a natural disaster.
Correct. Yeah. What happened? Well, we had a sort of temporary increase in rents as people moved in with family and rented neighbouring things, but we adjusted. And within a couple of years, there's no effect, right? The market adjusts over time. That's true with immigration.
But why was there no effect? Because they rebuilt the houses or what?
There's a lot of effects going. People relocate, they rebuild. There's a lot of margins in which the market adjusts. Right.
Also, people are mobile, I suppose.
People are mobile. They move. So
can, if something's priced way out of whack, then if it's super cheap in Lismore, maybe some hippies come and set up a bohemian commune.
That's true with the current sort of surprise post-COVID immigration. Yes, it's going to have rental effects in certain suburbs, near the universities, in the capital cities. But high rents induce more development of things, right? And over time, we adjust to that. And so I think this idea that, high immigration means this, well, if it's expected and we've adjusted to it, it doesn't necessarily mean...
It's a big if.
Well, it happened in just the last decade. So immigration was still in 2016-17, pretty much where it was in 2012-13, but prices were falling and rents were falling, but they were rising in 2013-14.
I mean, it's too complicated. Markets are too complicated for any single factor to be explanatory on its own. So I don't know what to make of data that says, look, this one thing was dialed up at this point at which it wasn't a single, it didn't have an effect. I don't know what else was going on.
And it takes time for these processes to happen.
But I do know, just to go back to the data again and my little sheets here, just because I didn't want to be talking totally out my ass, and because we're also talking to people who are not Australian, and I didn't have these stats to hand when I was talking to Dominic Frisby the other day, who we were talking about immigration, and he was suggesting that the UK had higher immigration per capita than Australia, which it doesn't. Absolutely does not, because it has something like 800,000 net migrants a year in a country that's well over twice, if not three times our population. So the year to March 2024. I don't know why these are a year old, but that's the Bureau of Statistics data? For you, the Australian data. 500.
That's the most recent permanent migration.
Okay, so 502. So basically, between 2022 and 2024, we were bringing in over 500,000 people net a year, right? Mm-hmm. Into a country of 25 million people. Mm-hmm. I don't understand, like, as a layperson who was taught in school that if there are 10 blokes selling an orange and there are 10 blokes who want an orange, then oranges will have a certain price. And if there are 10 blokes who want an orange and only 5 blokes selling an orange, it'll have a different price. And if there are 20 orange sellers and 5, and 10 orange buyers, it'll have a different price. So you bring in 500,000 people a year. You don't build accommodations for an additional 500,000 people a year. Why does that not put an upward pressure on the price?
Okay, so the price will rise if the rents rise or the yields falls or the expectations of growth increase. Remember, the asset price doesn't...
Wait, slow that down. So if...
The asset price of housing is you're buying a future stream of income, right? So its value depends on that future stream of income like any other asset. And
I mean, yes. Yeah. From an economist perspective, if you're an investor, you are. If you're a Chinese person who's just arrived with a bucket load of cash and you don't want the indignity of renting, then you're going to buy.
But remember, they can spend that money on a EFT, ETF and go and get 7% and rent a mansion wherever they want as well, right? So there's an opportunity cost to all that money you're going to invest.
Yes, it's not a perfectly rational market. People want to own their home.
The rationality of the market is not that individuals are rational, but all the buyers who've found sellers have done it and think they're both better off, even if they're complete wrong idiots and lose money. Right? The rationality is not that everyone's perfect maximizers. The rationality is that, well, if they traded, they both thought they were better off.
Yes, you're right. I mean, I misspoke if I said that it's not a rational market. I meant that the players in the market aren't behaving rationally. They're not behaving purely according to their economic interest.
Look, I'm an economist. I'm not going to say that people aren't doing that. They've got their idiosyncratic reasons for putting money wherever, right? So anyone who's buying
would you agree
house,
that some people will cop a lower return over the course of their lives for the pride of living in their own home?
Some people might, yeah.
I would hazard that a lot of people do that, including myself.
So that
I could do a lot. There's a lot more that I could do with those assets if I was strictly economically rational
and
about it.
That's part of the value, right? That's fine. But your point here is these 500,000 people they're not buyers of housing, right? They need to participate somewhere in the housing rental market or occupancy market, right? And yes, they may buy. They might buy an off-the-plan house, which triggers an extra project to get off the ground that wouldn't have otherwise been there, right? So off-the-plan, new housing essentially is built at a rate that meets the demand of buyers who come to buy, right? So most projects have a pre-sale period. So if you buy enough, you go, great, well, we're meeting the market. If you don't, well, we'll wait until the market's ready for us. And so the interaction of those people, whether they rent, they've increased rents in the inner suburbs of Sydney. That's great. That next build-to-rent project's going to get off the ground now. Okay, great. Maybe they've moved in with family temporarily. Okay, there's no issue there. Maybe they're in student accommodation. Great. That was empty for 3 years during COVID, and that industry is still growing as well, right? There's 150,000 student rooms in the capital cities, right? So the interaction of that with all those parts of the market is not instant, I'll give you that, which is why I say, like, when there's a natural disaster, rents go up nearby. But as those processes unfold, we adjust to it and we get back to the normal situation of rents being pretty much the same proportion of income and housing asset prices reflecting prevailing returns in the market.
Right.
So it definitely triggers changes, and definitely the temporary effects are needed to trigger those changes. So yeah, definitely.
So I mean, the alternative explanation, what I think it would be what I was kind of describing as a conventional economic explanation, the one that I hear from a lot of economists is that that in principle that's great, but those changes are impeded by policies. By zoning policies, by density policies, right? Ooh. Which brings us to this whole question of supply, right?
Right,
let's flex those. Let's flex those muscles. I can see the glint in your eye as we get into that one. That we've got this increased demand, and that our politicians and wonky bureaucrats are not good enough at that. We've got a lot of heritage protections. That you say, well, people could move into the same house. Sure, I know people who live in a $15 million house through no good doing of their own, just because they inherited it from their parents and it was not very expensive, but it's just a gigantic place in Balmain, and there should be incentives. Like now that they're retired, I think a lot of people would feel that there should be incentives and inducements to get them out of that place and to subdivide it and turn it into a bunch of terraces so that you can have medium density housing there instead of an elderly couple living on a massive, massive block of land, even though they're not rich. That's just one example of the many different ways, right?
That's great. So I have an article on this called something like, if you go to Fresh Economic Thinking, my website, it's called something like, kicking pensioners out of their home doesn't really solve much in the long run.
It's fun. It's fun though. It's fun.
So basically, all these big houses with one or two elderly people in them, people have a finite. Geez, I'm ruining it.
Yes, you're Sorry. Okay. You haven't actually spilled a glass of water yet.
All these people have a finite lifetime, right? So you can encourage pensioners to move out or downsize. Let's just say the average person dies at 80, but you encourage them to move out at 75. So you buy 5 years. What you're doing is just essentially bringing 1 or 2 years cohort forward. Like there's a finite flow of these things coming as everyone dies and houses get inherited, split up, whatever. But it's the same finite flow if it happens at 75 or 80. If you know what I mean. Everyone hits age 75, or the same flow hits 75 and the same flow hits 80. So you can temporarily encourage some shifts, but
assuming that the next generation who buy it are going to do something with it and not live in it.
Well, why shouldn't they? I mean, don't we trust the market to allocate homes?
Well, this is the criticism that the market may not be allowed to, because there might be a heritage listing on the place, and so that even if you wait for the people to die, then the kids might not be allowed to turn it into a row of townhouses.
Well, I trust that the market will find other places.
But this isn't the market. This is politicians setting zoning rules about what you can build where.
That's right. And this okay. So this is funny. I was at a planning event last night, and look, I have many frustrations with planners and planning, probably different ones to a lot of people. But I think that's true in all sort of sectors. But most people like planning in their city. So every city, historically, currently, has evolved some kind of planning system to protect the public realm, heritage, whatever, coordinate infrastructure, whatever. So there must be some value there. If you do a large private master plan subdivision community, what do? You basically plan it, you put strict rules on, you put covenants. So you have, like, the private sector plans more than the public sector when they can for property development. If you buy into some large estates, they will tell you what material and what color your fence has to be made out of, and how many meters high your hedge has to be, and what pebbles have to go in your driveway, right? They think it's great. So there's some positive value there, and I think
but people accept that because it's an optional buy-in, whereas I don't get really to choose to live.
So if heritage is imposed on you, there's an adjustment question there of should governments that impose heritage compensate people, or should they be required to buy the property and manage it as a heritage property? That's a conversation. But the point is, there's plenty of places.
I just mean I can imagine a libertarian saying, like, it's totally fine for a private company, for a private developer to boss me around about what I can do, because I didn't need to buy there and I don't need to stay there.
You don't have to stay in this council or city either.
Well, it's a bit different.
Why?
If I just do what I want to my house and it's a private development, they're just going to be like, you're not allowed to do that. But if I do it to my house in the council, then eventually they're going to lock me in a cage.
Well, just think of a council. Just think of a council as a suburban body corporate. Suburban,
but they're not, because they have police with guns that can lock me away.
Home ownership, just private security. I mean, police with guns ultimately enforce all rules, right?
Well, not in a private development. That's the point.
I mean, if you breach the contract, they try and get rid of you. The ultimate thing is they call
but they're not allowed to lock me in a cage for the rest of my life.
They will. They'll call the police and say, "This guy's not complying. You got to get rid of him. He's trespassing. This is our rules." So
there's no debtor's prison, though. You don't see a difference between a private company making rules for its employees or people who buy into it.
We can just incorporate the City of Sydney as a private company and make all ratepayers shareholders. I mean, it's just arbitrary institutional design, in my view.
Okay, I mean that will offend a lot of small L liberal or libertarian people who think that there's something uniquely problematic about the state. I mean, the state is when the state does something,
like protect
there's no
property
opt-out.
rights. That's the main job of the state, is protect your private libertarian property rights.
Sure.
They can have no state, and I'll just go build a house in their block alone. Like,
they're not
fine.
anarchists.
My arbitrary set of rules is the proper, noble, by nature, virtuous set of rules. I'm like, come on, guys. Like,
Okay.
I'm happy to get into the details. Heritage. So I think it's fine. I like, every time I come to Sydney, I think, geez, what a beautiful, well-planned city. Like, this is rich people in beautiful cities, and if I came from anywhere in the world and heard people go, oh, planning's really bad, housing's terrible here, look at the city, I'd just be thinking, what planet are you on? Your brain is destroyed. This is the most beautiful city in the world.
As someone who I've lived in Los Angeles and New York and London and other cities, so it is pretty good here. So
there's costs and benefits to all these types of rules, but I think the important thing is that you've got to also trust the market. There's this weird thing that, the market's going to solve all our problems, but if you just draw a little line around an old church or this street or these terraces, that the market's going to be destroyed and prices will blow up. Well, won't the market just substitute to a different location, or change the design, or renovate the use, or densify where the planning system wants you to? Like, why doesn't the market adjust spatially and geographically? Well, it does.
It does.
Yeah. So
but it's just isn't the criticism. I don't quite understand your point. So
the point is, I think people think that the planning system is like a quota, an annual quota. You can't build more than 30,000 houses this year. Okay, it's not a quota. It's a spatial set of rules. It's like lane markings on the road. Drive as many cars as you want, but if you're driving this way, you're on the left, or on the right in Europe or whatever. But you got to follow our spatial guidelines.
Yes.
Okay, but you put as many cars as you want.
I don't think anyone thinks it's a quota. I think they
do think it's a quota. Yeah, a lot of people think, planners are stopping houses. They're not relocating them or telling us what to build where. They are putting in a quota, and that's why there's not enough of them, because we can only build 20,000.
I don't know if they're using the word quota.
They're not.
Functionally, in a neighborhood that has no free land, right? In an inner city neighborhood. If your policy is that nothing can be more dense than the properties that are already there because they're all heritage protected, and so you can't go up on them because you're going to ruin the facade, then I suppose that is a quota.
Correct. At that location.
And
then we substitute.
I don't think people are under the impression that there's some kind of arbitrary meta quota where that's the number of people that are allowed to be there or something.
Okay.
I think if they're worried about something that smells like a quota, it's because they feel that the sensitivity of councils to anything that does not precisely conform to their own narrow bureaucratic interpretation of what is heritage are too finely tuned in too many places to allow the market to function the way that it might in order to incorporate the growth in population. So, at
a micro level, I agree. I think a lot of planning rules and heritage is not well tied to some kind of social aesthetic objective, right? It's just busybodies and people scared of change. And that's always been the case. I used to work for property developers 20 years ago, and even in the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast, a developer's wonderland. It was still the case there. Everyone was a busybody. Everyone was scared of change. And that's fine. We can have a conversation about that. But I think it's important to note that, we should want councils and the planning system to reflect the desires of people, don't we?
Well, it depends who the people are.
Well, the people who elect the council, the people who may move here in 10 years' time. I don't know. I mean, we should
Well, those are two very different. Those are two very different cohorts of people. Yeah. The people who may move here in 10 years' time may have different interests than the people who have been sitting in the same house for the past, however long, 40 years, and they just like the street the way that it was 40 years ago, and they don't want it to change. Their interests may diverge from the interests of the country.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the role of planning...
Well, it may not be fine because they're the ones who are voting for the people who are going to either allow or not allow more people to move into that street.
I think if we zoom out, this is a pretty niche, rich busybodies of Sydney problem. If you just zoom out and go to any town, that everyone's just begging developers to just build houses somewhere, okay? So, every time I come to Sydney, everyone's like, oh, yeah, houses this and that. Houses are $5 million. I'm like, they're $5 million in like 10 suburbs of Sydney.
Yeah.
This is a complete bubble.
No, but they're $2 million in a lot of suburbs of Sydney, or $1.5 million in a lot of suburbs.
Yeah. If you think of all housing, not just detached houses, and I think that's another thing, people get emotionally attached, like, oh, I'm going to have my detached houses now out of reach.
That means a freestanding house for Americans. Yeah,
the single family or something.
Single family home.
Yeah. But apartments, there's lots of reasonably cheap apartments in most places in most cities, right?
But this is actually something that does come up quite a lot as well, which is that we seem to have fallen back on the only ways of growing a big city like Sydney is either to acquire more land around the distant periphery and build lots of suburban homes on it, or to go up in the middle of the city and build, apartments, build lots of cheap, high-rise, pokey apartments. What do you make of proposals that I've heard from some Europeans about, we should have the density of living of a city like Paris, for example. The missing middle, exactly. And which is why suburbs that are like that in Sydney, and I'm sure in Melbourne, are the most sought after, right? They've got their terraced houses. They look a little bit like 19th century London, sort of. But, we're not really in the business of creating more of that medium density.
No, we're not. There's some good economic reasons for that. Firstly, if it's economical to do terrace housing, it's probably even more economical and more profitable to just do a small tower at the price point. The terrace housing or the townhouses or those semi-detached type houses probably more economical on the city fringe, because remember, where they are now was the city fringe.
Yes.
And so what you find, for example, where I'm from in southeast Queensland, a lot of the townhouses are going up in new estates. They're not, there's a bit of infill of them, and that's quite common where there's big blocks. But in new estates on the fringe, you're getting some townhouses as well, because that incremental change from one detached house to three, terrace houses is just not worth it economically. You sort of bulldozing one perfectly fine house, have to replace it with one and only get two extra. You may as well build 15, 20 apartments if you're allowed to. So that's sort of constraining things. Now, you could use the planning system to constrain that taller option in a suburb and get that lower density, and that's what it does in a lot of Sydney. It says, no, you can have short towers that aren't imposing.
Take the example of kicking, Nana and Pop out of their $14 million Balmain house, right? There's no way. It just would not be a desirable outcome to have a high-rise apartment there. Yeah. It's not consistent with the history of the place. But you could imagine putting 5 dwellings on that.
And I'll be honest, people are scared of change until it happens, and I get it. So the reason we have a lot of these really sort of frustrating design rules and things like that is because there was some pretty terrible, ugly buildings built that people didn't like, and they're around for a long time, and so we respond to that. And so I always encourage my developer mates, just put a little bit of effort in making it look good before you put this out. Because so the planning system has a lot of flexibility to exceed all these controls, right? So the way it typically works is we have these controls. If you comply, we'll probably just approve it because we've set these up based on our history of failure and bad things. But if you can think you can achieve what we want with this control, this setback or this design rule in a different way, you can do a different process that, the community gets some feedback on. And if you can convince everyone that that is better than complying with the setback, then you can do that as well, right? So it's sort of there is a really nice feedback mechanism there of, you only want 3 stories, but I got this 6-story design because my site has this particular uniqueness that you guys are going to love looking at every day. Look at this and how I've solved this access issue. And that happens all the time in Brisbane where I'm from. People go, oh yeah, okay, well that makes sense. Oh yeah, I like that. Oh, look what you've done with the footpath and stuff. So I always encourage people, you're part of the community when you're going to build something there. You gotta sell the sizzle a little bit.
Yes.
Don't just go, oh, I'm doing the controls, I'm going to build whatever I want. And so people do that. So I think there's some value from that as well.
And part of your argument against the conventional way of looking at this as a supply and demand issue is not just that the rules are not as strict as people say they are about
so that's one
but
element.
also that even if you abolished all the rules,
Yeah,
the
correct.
market would not supply the quantity of... Is that right? Am I getting you right? The market just wouldn't supply the quantity of new housing that would be required to bring prices down.
This is like the one intellectual idea I'm actually, I think I've contributed. So I finally found my niche. So thank you, Josh. Nerding out here. Yeah, that's basically right. So I think, how do I best explain this? People have this idea that houses are built when the price exceeds the input cost of construction and buying the land, right? So therefore, if we can rezone upwards so that the price is much higher relative to the land and construction, that will instantly be built, right? Because I've just created this profitable opportunity.
By rezone upwards, you just mean allow developers to do what they want.
So instead of allowing those 3 terrace homes on that site where you'd be like, oh, it's not worth as... If I had to buy the house plus build the 3, it's not worth it. But now I can build, 20 apartments and 5 stories. Now it's worth it.
Unleash the market upon the...
It doesn't mean it's going to happen instantly. And the problem here, supply and demand applies. I think the debate gets confused because there's a lot of concerned people who observe what happens in the market, and it's not what some economists say about supply and demand, and therefore they conclude, supply and demand doesn't apply to housing, right? They go, supply and demand doesn't apply. I'm like, oh God, it must apply. It's literally...
Who says supply and demand doesn't apply?
If you look at planners and social policy people trying to contribute to the debate and go, supply and demand doesn't work, we need public housing or something.
Oh, I see, right.
Yeah.
Lefty NIMBYs say that supply and demand.
That's also them.
Right.
Also them. But you've got to understand the cost for a development is not the cost of land and the cost of building. It's the full opportunity cost. So this is where economics is different from accounting. And the opportunity cost includes the value of not building and waiting and building next year, or building in 10 years, or building 20 stories in 10 years instead of 3 stories today. And so it's actually a rate of return type calculation. So the question...
And why would it be more lucrative to wait till next year to make your money?
So let's just say I got a block of land, I paid $5 million, right? I can go and build my 3 terrace houses, and I can cream off a margin there of $2 million at the end. So far, I haven't paid the construction cost or anything. I've just paid the $5 million. In 10 years' time, I might be able to build my 20 apartments. And the value of my land in 20 years' time to build apartments might be $20 million. So by not building, I can also take my $5 million, get the rent of this one house, which might not be much, and then sell it in 10 years for $20 million without building. Because if I've built those 3 townhouses, those 3 terraces, it's not going to be profitable to knock them down and build a tower in 10 or 15 years. But if I wait and don't build, it might be. So the trade-off is not the cost of building versus selling. It's the cost of waiting, or it's actually the benefit of waiting versus the benefit of going now, which is higher.
Right.
And in the equilibrium, so basically once everyone's traded and have a guess at what the market's going to do, it should be that I should be able to buy a block of land and get the same risk-adjusted return as any other asset in the economy without actually building a house. Because if I didn't, the price would be wrong. So I should make the same compounding 7% return from not building as I get if I build, put all that money in and rent the houses out, or sell the houses and what the buyer will get. So that's this tricky thing. This is why when prices start falling, I'm like, well, I'm going to stop building, even though the price is higher than what I get, because if I'm going to be selling in a year when prices are lower, that's not a good time to sell. I'll try and wait this out for the future.
You're talking about long-term investment, right? That there may be an incentive to delay because the rental return that you might get on the 3 terraces might be the same as you would get from the stock market or anywhere else you might park your money.
Correct. And all those developers have the alternative of putting their money in the market, right?
But isn't the business model of most developers that they flip it? That they buy the thing, they build the thing, they sell the thing, and they move on and they do it again? Isn't the idea that they wouldn't be sitting on it for 10 years? So there's no opportunity cost?
We're breaking up that into different people doing different parts of this process, right? So the developer does the building part, right? But they only do the building part if the buyer shows up to buy it.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a lot of situations where you'll do a design, get your approval, start selling it. No one wants to buy it. So you don't build it. right? Okay, well, I'll stop and I'll wait because change the design, go back in 5 years, try a different design, see if I can sell it. Oh, buyers aren't there. Wait, change the design, go back. Oh, it's a boom time. Everyone's buying. Okay, now I build. So the net effect of all those interactions of people just responding to the market in front of them is this equilibrium effect, as if one
Right,
person...
I see. So it's the same regardless of whether it's
regardless of how you
one.
break up the component parts of the process.
Yeah,
the
right.
net effect is the same. And so that's why, for example, when the market goes down, well, people stop showing up to buy pre-sales, so people stop building, right? And and when the market's booming, all those pre-sales get taken up. So, okay, we're building houses now, right?
Yeah, right.
So that's how that interaction happens. And the economic way of describing that is there's a trade-off between waiting and going. That's the trade-off, not between
and
today's...
what leads you to believe that phenomenon is a large enough phenomenon to negate the benefits of a looser, less restrictive building policy framework?
Because if you look historically and internationally at all points in time with all different planning rules, you find essentially the same patterns in housing concerns. Right?
But does it? Because I mean, my layman's impression from just listening to people who seem to know a lot about this sort of stuff is that in markets where there's high demand and no increase in supply or a finite supply,
like where?
New York City or something like that, there's upward pressure, and that's why a lot of people go to Texas, where they can just build whatever you want wherever you want.
Yeah,
you can buy a 5-bedroom home for $300,000.
You can. I mean, if you look at rent-to-income ratios, they're pretty high in Texas relative to...
Well, that's because everyone went. But I mean, literally, Texas is the perfect example of this phenomenon happening over the past 10 or 15 years, right?
Yeah,
because everyone's fled Los Angeles and
San
Francisco.
But if you measure
but then park Texas, because it's the sort of example of massive rapid change. Talk about Milwaukee or some random place, where people could go to live, where it's easier to build.
You can get cheap housing if no one wants to live in your city as well, right? So that's another thing, right?
But are you saying that there's because
if you've got a booming, growing city, this is the problem of the whole 1800s. We had booming, growing cities, and prices would just shoot up, and people would be squeezed out, and they'd be living in slums on the hills. Of course,
right? That's one phenomenon, but we're trying to focus.
But there's no town planning there, right? This is the free market.
Yeah, but we're trying to focus on things that we can. On levers that we can move, not ones that we can't.
Okay, great. Let's talk about that. What outcome would you want? Before we talk about a lever, we need to know what we're trying to achieve. So what do you think we should try and achieve?
I think I'm not speaking for me, I think most people would say that we want property prices to remain at least flat so that inflation eats them away, or maybe decline very gradually over time.
So you can just put the interest rates up if you want that. Keep pushing them up.
That has all kinds of other externalities.
Exactly.
Doesn't it?
Well, this is the thing. You can't just make prices be flat because everyone who buys houses can buy in other asset markets, and the price will be set as all these trading adjustments happen, so that the return returns to the equilibrium.
So is it mythology when people sort of talk about, like, to take another example,
that there is this magic, we're all rich, but houses are really cheap?
No.
And we're only spending 5% of our income on housing.
No. That if you were less constipated about exactly how people could develop neighborhoods. If you were more like Florida, for example, where, with the exception of historic districts in Miami, you can sort of go down and you can do whatever you want. People make the claim that leads to a more vibrant economy, more, cheaper housing, than places that are more uptight, like California.
I mean, it leads to different houses in different locations, which is fine. And some areas will be growing a lot, and a lot of builders will move there, and some areas won't. Like, we're just relocating these effects. In terms of the aggregate, I mean, you can only suppress prices in an aggregate, right? Because people move between Sydney and Melbourne. Imagine if Sydney prices came down 30%. What would happen? How would they stay there? Everyone would just move to Sydney, or buy houses. It's cheap. 30% decline means my yield has gone up from, say, 4% to 5.5%.
Yeah,
I can now essentially borrow money and make free money by buying a house in Sydney. We're going to pile in and push those prices up.
No, I mean, I get it, but I mean, I also think that Australia is a weird example because we don't have many cities. We've got these gigantic cities.
Yeah, but I think we've got to get our minds out of the physical and into the economic. Yeah, we don't have many cities. Okay, we could have 5 poor, declining cities with cheap houses.
No, I get it. No, but hang on. I didn't finish that thought. I didn't finish that thought.
So
there's a lack of opportunity to migrate when there's only so in the United States, if you get priced out of San Francisco, there are 50 different medium-sized places that aren't super hip that you can go to. You can go to Milwaukee, right? In Australia, if you want to live somewhere that's happening, there are 3, maybe 4 cities, 5 at the most. We don't have anywhere where the prices are the price of a. There's no $500,000. There's no city. There isn't a belt of cities with populations of 500,000 people that people want to live in. So I'm not saying that it's not an economic question. It is, but it's all or nothing. It's famine or feast here. Either you live in a gigantic, fabulous, glitzy city with a harbour bridge and the beaches, whatever. Or you live in Wagga Wagga in a country town. Like, there aren't very many Newcastles and...
There's a few. In Brisbane, you can go to Ipswich, Logan, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, Toowoomba. Like, that's just Brisbane, where I'm from, and, second best city at
Those
least.
Those are all basically suburbs of Greater Brisbane.
Yeah, that's fine. But they're all substitutes. I mean, you're just saying, well, what's the right number? Let's just say Australia's got 3 big cities and each big city has a dozen substitute areas. Okay. Adding another dozen is going to change the price in Sydney? How? Because if it was desirable, the price would be high. Like the Gold Coast after COVID was kind of cheap before COVID. Suddenly, no one wanted to live in Melbourne. It became desirable. So prices boomed. Like, there's no sort of way to keep them down if they become desirable as well.
Yeah, no, prices. But don't you? Isn't it? If there are 20 places that are desirable to live, and I'm not talking about names that you can pull out of your bum that are that are basically the suburbs of Brisbane. I'm talking about actual other cities that don't feel like satellites. That are cities like, Birmingham and Liverpool and Edinburgh in the UK, or Toulouse or Marseille or any other city. And
we'll do a little another economics break, okay? There's this concept called spatial equilibrium.
Right.
So I've been talking about the asset prices, right? That Sydney houses just can't be cheap because we'll trade other assets for them and bid up until we get to this equilibrium. So those trading opportunities sort of constrain what the price can be. That's true geographically or spatially as well, right? So the ratio of prices between the capitals and the regions is what it is because of the quality of life difference, right? The regions are cheap because no one wants to go there. And if they got cheaper, people would go there. But if they got more expensive, they'd move to the city because it's all about that gradient, or the relative pricing dictates where people live. So now what's happening, for example, during COVID, people left Victoria, world's longest lockdowns, etc., came to Queensland, where I'm from. Queensland property prices and rents, there's a construction boom because of this, because, that immigration to Queensland has those ripple effects through the market. But prices are very high. We're highest relative to Sydney and Melbourne than we've been since before the financial crisis. So what's happening? Well, people are moving back to Melbourne from southeast Queensland now because that spatial equilibrium, it just can't be the case that the quality of life different. The quality of life in each city is sort of mismatched to the relative prices. So people relocate, and that returns those relative prices. So you don't need many alternative places for that to happen. I mean, it happens within cities, within suburbs, within a street. If you've got a street where there's a view up on a hill and not down the hill, of course, your quality of life's going to be better up on the hill with the breeze and the view. So I don't think we can sort of combat that by, what would we do? We have Canberra. We've tried to build a new city for 100 years.
I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do. I'm just saying that I think it's a reason why Australians find themselves in something of a pickle, because I have this conversation at Barbies all the time with friends who are like, do we go to Brizzy? That's pretty expensive now as well. Do we go to Canberra? One of my friends did move to Canberra. Love Canberra. That's certainly an option. And if there were a dozen Canberras with various climates and various kind of flavours and various styles, that would open up a lot more opportunities for people who can't afford to get into Sydney and Melbourne. It wouldn't fundamentally alter the economics, but it sounds to me like we're living in a country where there are only Lexuses and Toyota Yaris's. And I'm saying we should just have more like Camrys and more like just regular family cars, more Subarus. And you're saying it makes no difference because the Economist says that it will always flip either to the Yaris or the Lexus, and it doesn't matter how many you have in the middle. It's like, of course it doesn't really, right? But there aren't. And
Australia
does
not have middles. I think Camry and
Forester
are the two best-selling cars after Toyota Hilux.
I know, because people like middles. People like that's where people want to sit.
Yeah, I think
what is a medium-sized
You're
attractive
exaggerating
city
the difference here, right? The suburbs are sort of the equivalent, right? They are the
Yes,
suburbs
that's right.
of the capital, the equivalent.
But then you have to usually endure a long commute. And
I mean, this is a matter of like finite elements of people's different tastes for city size, location, climate, and whatnot, right? And if there were people who wanted to move to Toowoomba or Canberra because it was relatively cheaper, then they would. But they don't. Well, some do and some don't.
The ones who want to do.
There's the ones who want to do, the ones who want to move the other way, and the relative price constrains those moves. So I guess the end point of spatial equilibrium is no one moves because all the prices are like, oh, if it was cheaper, I'd move there. If it was cheaper, I'd move there.
Yeah.
But this is the best I can do.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm not saying that
this must happen no matter how many.
I'm not saying that this is a cause of, I think you're misunderstanding me. I'm not saying this is a cause of high prices in Sydney and Melbourne. I'm saying it's a cause of Australia's sociological fixation on, partly on property, because we're all dumped in the same handful of buckets, and there's not a lot of in the States. You would just go. If you got to the point where you no longer wanted to live, you'd go move to Philly. You don't have to be in New York City. There's no Philly here.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know what we're meant to do about that. Honestly,
nothing. I'm not saying.
Like there was some recent research about the relative proportion of population in the top few cities in Australia versus other countries. It's not super abnormal, right? Because our big cities aren't mega cities, right? So if you've got a couple of mega cities, that really changes in terms of relativities. It's the same slope. It's just the populations are bigger, right? In the US and some other places.
Yeah, I don't think it's true that we're even remotely close to the US in terms of the
relative population in the top two cities.
Yeah,
we'll have to check this. Remind me. There was an article recently.
I'll bet you $100 that the population of Greater Sydney and Greater Melbourne combined is a greater proportion of Australia's population than the population of Los Angeles and New York.
I'm sure for the US it is, but it's pretty common in a lot of countries.
Yeah, there are some. I mean,
the US is a bit of an outlier in actually terms of its geographic distribution.
Yeah.
A lot of countries are essentially one or two megacities and no one else. That's pretty common around the world.
Yeah, they're just not as vast as we are, I suppose. Like there's a disincentive to living in Perth, for example, in Australia, just because we're big. Like that would factor in.
Depends if you want to get on a different time zone and tune out a bit, right? Like that's also, some people might like that, right?
So obviously the ideal, if we're talking about just options before we get to solutions of people who have who are being priced out of markets where prices are crazy high. The other thing I'm surprised that we don't do more of is just move overseas to where our money goes a lot further. Like if I had bought a $30,000 property in 1982 and it was now worth $4 million, I'd just go and buy a $200,000 property in Thailand and spend millions of dollars living like a king.
Yeah, well, I mean, people do. Like I sometimes, because I'm involved in property, and I did a podcast recently on about Australians leaving for Southeast Asia to make their money go further, right? Like bailing on the cost of living in Australia. There's a whole YouTube industry explaining how to do it, right? And how to get out of Australia. I think the reality of it is, though, income opportunities here are just so much higher. If you don't have a mobile job or a lump of cash that you've got, if you're starting out here and can't afford a house, you're no better and can't move your job. You're no better off there either, right?
Yeah.
And if you have a house here and a good job, well, your opportunity for growing that job in person is much higher. So it's just a few people with mobile jobs who may have a bit of cash or inherited money or sold a house who are like, okay, now it's time to enjoy life. And there's a whole little cottage industry of it. There's also retirees cashing in and spending the pension in another country. And there's a discussion about the rules there of how long you can be out of the country and still get your pension, etc.
It's not 6 months and a day? I would have just guessed that you have to be...
it's something like that, right? Yeah. These are one of those niche rules that actually changes. You don't hear much about.
Yeah,
I think it's you have to be here 6 months and a day.
Cut them off, kick them out, sell their home.
Periods as well, right?
Build a high-rise.
Can't be gone more than 90 days at a time, things like that.
Yeah, right.
So it's a bit cumbersome. But that's been around a long time too. You remember the movie about the retired British pensioners moving to India and the guy ran that hotel, Best Exotic Marigold Hotel?
Oh, right.
Is that it?
Yeah. No, I never saw it.
No, that was 20 years ago.
Yes.
And the film was all about the pensioners in the UK way worried about the cost of living and moving
Spain,
to India.
Absolutely. Yeah, there were a lot of people after Brexit complaining that they voted for Brexit and then didn't realise that meant they couldn't stay in Spain.
So this is another part of the spatial equilibrium, right? But it's just that the total quality of life constraints are much more binding on most people because of working in person, family, the opportunity for growth, the school. What are the topics at the barbecue again? Schooling and housing.
Exactly. And that may change as we become more mobile.
That's right. There may be amazing international schools in a lot of cities in Southeast Asia, and people are like, well, that's even better than fancy grammar school in whatever suburb of Sydney.
So to wrap us up, Cameron, and I'm sure that's true. It sounds like you're saying two things. It sounds like you're saying there were lots of great ideas that we could apply to the housing crisis, and also there isn't a housing crisis.
So I'm saying, what is a housing crisis for a small sliver of people? And I would say, if we lay this out, say 70% of people are homeowners, 25% in private rental, a bit under, and half of them are going to be fine. They're just young, they're at uni, they're whatever, they'll be fine. So you're now talking about a sliver of sort of 10% of the households in the country who are really feeling squeezed. Their rents have gone up. They wanted to, maybe a proportion of them were ready to buy a house. It's a crisis for them temporarily in terms
of... Why are you assuming that it's not a crisis for any of the 70% who own? I mean, they obviously do own. So by definition, if you're defining crisis as cannot own, then they're not in crisis.
Right. Yeah.
But if you're defining crisis as are paying way more for an asset that they ever would have wanted to, and then seems reasonable to the layperson, then they could still be in crisis.
Well, if they have a 2% mortgage for 2 years, they've paid down their mortgage, typically their price has gone up. There's just not many people who bought at the wrong time in the last 5 years who've been exposed to high interest rates, who haven't already sold out and are still in the market. Like the last year, we had the record number of homes resold within 2 years of previous purchase. So people who got in at low interest rates went up, they've got out. So maybe they're upset because now they're in the renting pool. So there's a small, sliver of people. And I think that's why the politics of it lends us to things like, well, let's subsidize first home buying, because that is not going to upset anybody else in the market. And that's what we've done historically for 40 years. And we do it in lots of different ways. We give stamp duty discounts. So that's a tax on buying your home.
Should we get rid of stamp duty, by the way, and replace it with a property tax or something?
This is a very...
As someone who's currently selling and buying only 3 years after having bought, it is a bit galling to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in tax every time I trade.
In Sydney, New South Wales stamp duties are pretty high relative to Queensland and, say, the ACT or Western Australia and things like that. So you could probably reduce them a lot, but it does raise a lot of money, and it is sort of what we call pro-cyclical. So when there's a boom, you raise more money, and when there's a bust, you raise less. And you want governments not to raise lots of money when there's an economic downturn. You want them to spend more. So the argument with stamp duty, this tax on trade, is, more trade's better. People are incentivized to trade less often because there's a tax on trading. If we traded more often, it would be better. The problem with this is...
Well, I think I would phrase it as the reverse, which is that there's something perverse about penalizing the moment of purchase when what you're trying to do is
a few things.
Raise revenue off of a valuable asset.
We tax it because it's hard to avoid, because we run the titles office. We know who owns what. And that's how you should tax. The other thing is the price isn't really added to the price. So the price gets netted off, right? So stamp duty is not a surprise to anyone in the market. We know we have to pay it. And so when I go to you think about this, right? I'm at an auction, I'm bidding against you. We get to $1 million and we've got to pay $50,000 stamp duty. And then during the auction, we go, pause. Actually, the government's just announced you don't have to pay $50,000. And we go, oh, sweet, I'll pay $1,050,000 now. And we bid it up to $1,050,000. So if we knew that it was there, it's already comes off the price.
Yeah. I was more saying, is it a good tax rather than is it inflationary on property?
The economic question is it better? Is it a better way to raise pro-cyclically $8 billion per year in New South Wales? Is there a better tax than that? That's the question.
Well, a lot of the people who want to reform it will say that if the point is to tax property, then just tax the property and value the property and tax that each year.
Yeah, land taxes are great, but the best tax economically and possibly one of the most difficult politically, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, and I'm stuck in this situation. If that's true, I don't want you to reduce stamp duty and not get a property and a land tax, because you're just
No. Yeah, it would have to be.
yeah.
It would have to be tax
So,
reform.
but there's it prohibits trades. There's a few forgotten parts of this debate, right? Is more trades better, or does more trades, like if there were more share trades, if we could do microsecond instead of millisecond trades, would that lead to more equal ownership of assets in the share market or more concentrated ownership? Because that's more frequent trading, right? And that's what happens in the property market if you get rid of stamp duty. You get more frequent trading. Now, does that advantage the already wealthy who are better at timing the market, or does it not? It's not clear. It's not obvious economically that more trading is better from a social point of view. For example, New Zealand hasn't had a stamp duty for 40 years. Their home ownership rates dropped 10%. Ours has dropped less than 2%, right? Why is that? Is that because of more trading and more benefits to investors getting ahead and timing the market? I don't know. So more trading not on its face is not good. And
wait, I don't want to get too bogged. I don't want to lose the last. I want to let you out of here.
Okay.
And I don't want to get too bogged down on stamp duty, because that was an aside. I was just interested in your thoughts about it.
But I know I've written many articles.
It's not
been
the
going
main
for 10
target,
or 20 years.
right?
This
like,
argument.
This is obvious. So
yeah, okay. We could do that.
Yeah, kind of want you to step back and explain. So is there a housing crisis? Seems to be no. Then should we care and change anything?
Well, that's the question. What do you want to change? Do you want people to have a cheaper place to live in a nice location? So where I get to in my book is that historically the way we got poor people to stay in desirable locations is we gave them subsidised housing. And if I look historically and I look abroad, the cities that have this have poor people in capital cities in nice areas have some kind of non-market housing option. There just aren't these solutions that solve that problem of that sliver of people getting squeezed out. So we can do that if that's what we want. It's not free or easy either, right? You have to work out who qualifies, how we allocate it, how we build it, acquire it, manage it. The very first public housing schemes after the First World War were essentially scammed by rent-seeking of the relatives of the state governments in New South Wales and Victoria, right? All their relatives had these amazingly overpriced subdivisions for the war homes, war service homes and things. So it's not easy, but you could sort of build up non-market housing up to 5 or 10% of the market.
So this is social housing, public housing, basically, either free housing for the poor or heavily subsidised housing. Or
my preference is
rents.
you offer a cheap purchase agreement. So in Singapore, you buy your public housing on a 99-year lease, right? And so you get a mortgage, you buy it.
It's owned by the government. You pay the rent to the government, but a governmental body.
You're buying out the rent for 99 years. Right. That's what you're buying.
Yeah.
But you can resell it. So that whole issue of rent control and social housing, of people stuck in a position for their life and not being able to move and make allocation
they lose
choices.
the cheap rent.
You allow people to retrade within that system into someone else who qualifies. So you can start with a small place, move to a bigger place with a family, etc. So if you wanted to do something to solve that, you could do that. The current thing we're doing is subsidising first home buyers more with sort of finance subsidies in terms of the mortgage insurance guarantee, stamp duty discounts. That kind of works to a degree to, on balance, shift buyers from investors to first home buyers by essentially just saying, well, you're a first home buyer, here's a $50,000, $80,000 head start on this guy.
Right.
That'll give you a slight advantage. No stamp duty, no mortgage insurance, cheaper interest rate, etc.
And in terms of so if we use public housing, social housing, those kinds of schemes for the poor, then are you saying that because the main chatter, when we talk about these predictable middle-aged, middle-class people at barbecues going on about their kids, what schools to send their kids to, and the housing crisis, what they're talking about is the frustration that middle-class and working families feel in what seem like eye-watering prices for property. That complaint, you're saying, is basically illusory, right? That
That's
it's always it is
game,
always the case that everybody has always felt like, why is it so expensive to buy?
Because we're all trying to live at the edge of our ability in the best suburb we can for our thing. I mean, that's spatial equilibrium, right? We think it's worth the extra few dollars to move to that better suburb, and that we always stretch ourselves to that limit.
So everyone's saying, why am I just short of the place where I belong?
Yeah,
because they think of the place where they belong as
Yeah,
being the place
correct,
that's just
correct.
above
And I
where
think
they are.
you're exactly right. And I got a mate who says, it's the frustration of seeing, the mechanic Joe down the street who bought in that suburb, 50 years ago, and you did all the right things. You went to university and this and that. You work your ass off, and Joe can live the lifestyle that you can't. And that's sort of the way he describes this.
Yes.
Status frustration. And yeah, it's true, but I mean,
it's life.
That's sort of life in a growing rich city. Right?
It's a bit like the
person who gets their first wins. But if you could have the opposite. Sydney could have not grown and been poor, and Joe would have not.
Yeah, and you don't want that either.
You don't want that either.
It reminds me of the old line that how rich you are depends on how rich your brother-in-law is.
Yeah.
It's like that's sort of that's the social status yardstick, essentially.
Yeah,
you can make $500,000, but if your brother-in-law makes $1 million.
So a lot of the chatter, I think a lot of people would say, well, if you're in a fancy eastern suburb of Sydney comparing private schools and complaining about housing at barbecues, that's sort of your opinion is not valid in this thing. That is just a status game. Maybe that's true, but I've been around property a while. This has always been the case. The status games in this. It's just I think what we've had in the last few years is a real unexpected nominal surge in prices and rents, a big post-COVID adjustment, not just in Australia but abroad, and that has really amplified all these concerns that exist all the time because we've just seen sort of a change in fast forward. And so sometimes an economist would say a lot of it's money illusion. We're seeing inflation, but we don't know how to comprehend it because some of it's in prices, some of it's in rent, some of it's in our income. And what's really funny about that is when there's inflation and our incomes go up, we go, yeah, that's because me, I'm working hard, my income went up, the price of milk went up. No, that's someone else doing that to me. But my income, no, that was me. So I take credit for that. Blame someone else for that, but it's just both all the prices rising because of inflation. So I think we're at this odd point in time where that is happening as well as the low interest rate period and the housing adjustment, all these things at the same time. So we end up with what is a kind of a confusing housing debate and people saying comfortable things like, oh, just get rid of heritage and solve planning. But if we zoom out, look historically, I think we can sort of see these periods have happened many times. It will change if we really care about the sliver of people who we want to live in cities. I think people resonate with the nurses, police, teachers, etc., whose incomes are somewhat fixed statewide, but we still want them in nice areas. Then you can see the logic for having some kind of non-market accommodation programs beginning now.
Fascinating. Cameron, great to talk to you.
Thanks for having
mate.
me. Thanks, Rob.